Now, having said that, to needle you a little, can you tell me what Alawaki's due process was?
Yeah, so I think that different cases require different levels of due process. And so alien enemy. I have a lot of things to tell you about that, and I think it's really interesting because so we have some common ground on the First Amendment stuff.
So
I understand there's some play on the joints here, but here's a couple of the big problems with what's going on. One is I think that you agree that at a bare minimum, and by the way, I think this is borne out in case law. That I know it's borne out in case law. Alleged alien enemies under a presidential proclamation should have the right to contest whether they are in fact alien enemies under the proclamation.
I agree.
I think it would be so silly, for example, to just like the government just gets to pick out anybody, even a citizen, and they say not only you have to, it's binding our determination on as to who is an alien enemy. The courts can't even review it. What I find really bad faith about all this isn't just that they didn't give hearings, and maybe you could say that the proclamation itself. I don't agree with this, by the way. I think it's very dangerous, but maybe you could make the argument that the proclamation itself, the courts need to give deference to the executive's determination as to what is an invasion and who's invading. I don't agree with that, but I've heard some people, argue that. But what I find so bad faith is the Trump administration is in oral arguments, and they say like the following thing. They say, yes, we recognize that you have a habeas corpus right to petition a court to determine whether you're an alien enemy. And the judge asked an oral argument, okay, you say that they have a right, but if we were to dissolve this temporary restraining order, would you have an obligation to give notice to all the alleged alien enemies about what the basis is for their removal and to tell the lawyers where they are? And they're like, no, we could instantly get rid of them. And even though we recognize they have a right to habeas corpus, that we don't have to give them any notice and we don't need to tell their lawyers where they are so they can actually file the damn petitions. And to me, that indicates bad faith because they're acknowledging what the case law is, that they have these procedural rights, but it's all kind of fugazi. It's a procedural rights without any teeth to them. If the Trump administration is saying they don't have to give notice, they don't have to give any opportunity for them to actually file the damn things. That pisses me off.
So like the easiest way to argue against this for someone who's not like diving deep into the case law is this. What happens if the government, you're a citizen, what happens if the government tomorrow throws you in a van and says you're going to El Salvador, you're a member of Transdargawa? How do you protest against that? You're like, I'm a fucking citizen, ask all my neighbors, shut up. You don't get your day in court. You're going to El Salvador. What do you do to defend that? You say, well, that wouldn't happen to me because I'm a citizen. How do you prove that? You don't get a day in court to even attempt to prove that, let alone to prove that you're not a member. So to me, there are two separate issues here. One, anyone that's here illegally, should we have the right to deport? Yes. Is that day in court the same as your day in court if you're accused of being a member of a terrorist organization? No. Sort of the standard of proof to prove that you're here not legally is different than claiming you are basically a terrorist. And so if we're going to have a different deportation status for people that we're claiming are terrorists, and the end result of that is one-way ticket to prison in El Salvador, those people have to, even if they're illegal, those people should have the right to hear the charge against them and to contest it. Period.
Yeah.
So many people are like, who gives a fuck? They're illegal. Then send them back to their country of origin. But to use this, the reason that Trump is using this particular statute, right, the Alien Enemy Act, is because they're thinking that expediency and sort of the level of punishment requires that these people be treated under a different standard than your average run-of-the-mill illegal would be. Right. And so if you're going to, and it is clear that the treatment of getting sent to a prison in El Salvador is not something that you would prefer as opposed to just being sent back to your country of origin. And so I think that the burden is on the government. I disagree with you that it's not that Trump doesn't have the right to articulate as the executive who this applies to as far as the criminal gangs and whatever.
The proclamation, you think that the court should have to defer to the determinations of the proclamation?
I think that it's dangerous, right? At least at the federal court level, it's too much power to allow one federal court judge to be able to question the executive's sort of proclamation on that. But once that proclamation is issued, I think that you still have a due process right as basically being accused of being a terrorist to be able to sort of hear those charges and defend against them. Because even if one person, now listen, it could be that you're hearing all these stories. This guy was just a gay soccer player in Venezuela. It might all be bullshit, but it might not be. It might not be. And then what? What a fucking asshole you look like.
Well, then you have no right? Like you're in El Salvador. They have, by the way, they lost contact with that guy, and now the courts almost certainly don't have any jurisdiction. Like the government doesn't even have them in their custody, and so the government couldn't even be forced probably to effectuate an international trade of release. Now the court would be overstepping by I think it's arguable, right, that the court could be overstepping by saying, issuing an order to the president saying, hey, you have to trade for Paco because you shouldn't have deported him in the first place. That is very scary, which is why, by the way, I think that the Trump administration should have followed the oral order of turning the planes around, because I think it's ridiculous.
I think that was too far. That's too much, because there's already cooperations that you're making with people on the other side. I think that was too much. I also think that I haven't looked into this.
Would that be true of U.S. citizens, though, Rob? Real quick. So if there was a U.S. citizen who was just thrown on a plane and they're taking them to Guantanamo Bay or El Salvador, and a judge says, "What the fuck is a U.S. citizen? Turn the plane around." You think the equitable jurisdiction of the court ends at the border of the United States, and they can't even effectuate?
I think that the request to turn around a plane is a bridge too far in that sense. Like, now we're talking about this would only matter in cases of like 3-hour window or so from the time that plane's in the air. But yeah, I think that that's too much. Like, what if there's a safety concern? What if the pilot's like, we literally didn't plan
then it would be
trip.
Impossible. Well, yeah, if the order is impossible, I would give the executive some room not to follow the order, or to have an excuse to follow the order. If for example, you don't have enough fuel, right? Or there's some logistical reason why it literally is impossible to effectuate the order, then I think you follow what the court says, and you say, listen, court, we know that there was this order. We could not follow it because X, Y, Z. But Trump is going into court and saying, we don't even have to give you the evidence to prove whether we complied or not. That, to me, like, I'm scared about that.
I don't know about that. I will say one of the things that I've heard, again, I haven't looked into the actual court filings, right? But one of the things I heard that I think people on my side were making, that like was this sort of argument that's like, oh, this judge is demanding to see classified information. Well, that's not really how I'm reading it. What he's saying is,
you're right.
Listen, I want to see the info. And if you're saying it's classified, you have to give me some sort of justification for why I can't see it.
That's exactly what he said.
I think reasonable. I think that's a reasonable thing for this judge to say. Ultimately, my gut feeling for how this plays out is that I think that it will get to the Supreme Court and they'll say something similar to what I said. I think they'll say that the executive has the right to sort of give the proclamation, but there has to be some standard of due process given to the people that are accused of being in the proclaimed group. And I think that, as far as I'm concerned right now, Trump hasn't met that burden. And maybe because they'll find it to be weak. Maybe their burden was like, well, we saw a social media post of tattoos, and that was enough for us. And it's like, is it? I don't know, right? And I think that that's largely why. Now, having said that, to fucking needle you a little, can you tell me what Alawaki's due process was?
Yeah, so I think that different cases require different levels of due process. And so, first of all, I don't accept necessarily that every execution of an American citizen abroad is constitutional, legal, or criminal. But I do think, by the way, that the Alawaki killing is reviewable by a court. I think that the court has jurisdiction. Hang on. The remedy for that, there could be damages violations. There could be some kind of, a court case, or there could be, for example, if a prosecutor was looking to charge President Obama, I think the court, they issued a subpoena. I don't think that or some kind of evidentiary records to get the records of the administration. I think that they would be required to comply with that subpoena. So I definitely think that there's remedies available, especially for the government to vindicate it. And
real quick,
I want to address what you're saying real quick, because another example could be Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War ordered the death of other American citizens in the Civil War. He, by necessity, was calling for some group of Americans to kill and murder other Americans. And so I agree that there are times when the president will have the right, based on the facts and circumstances, to order the death without a trial of an individual. Just like, by the way, a person in self-defense, what is the right of deadly self-defense? It's the right to summarily execute someone because of the circumstances.
Sure.
But the most important thing, though, to recognize is it's reviewable. There is jurisdiction. There's a remedy somewhere.
There is remedy. Like, this will go to the Supreme Court. You agree with that, right?
Maybe. But the question is, will the Supreme Court review it on the merits? Because the Supreme Court, I think you're actually right that the most likely outcome in the Supreme Court is that the court says you can't really question the proclamation, or you have to give the proclamation great deference. I would very disagree with that ruling, but I do think that's probably where they are at in terms of unitary executive. But I do think the court was probably more willing to lean on the procedural due process and that kind of aspect. So I don't think that your prediction is wholly wrong. But the question is, will the court actually review? So imagine the court said, we're going to dismiss everything because we lack jurisdiction, because anything the president says is due process in this context is due process, and because we can't even review the proclamation, and so there is no judicial remedy for this. I don't think that's true of Alawaki. I think that there should be.
Let me ask you this. Maybe maybe I'm incorrect about this, but did a prosecutor ever bring a case against Obama or the Obama administration?
No, because the truth is it was a justified killing.
Where are all the lefties that give a shit about due process?
Lefties did care about the Alawaki killing. They were incredibly
then why
pissed at
didn't
Obama.
Any left
You're talking about libs. Where are the Obama supporters that are pissed about Alawaki, right?
Well, yeah. Where are the legal groups that are right now outraged about due process? Where were they then?
Well, there were lawsuits filed by Alawaki's family to sue the government over that. They ended up losing for lack of standing, because I don't think it was actually their direct descendant or something. It was like a cousin. That's my recollection. I'll have to look at the filing there. So there were actually court cases about it. I don't think they were successful. But just because you believe in due process doesn't mean you think the due process requires in every context the same amount of procedure. For example, right? If a bunch of American citizens are about to crash into the World Trade Center, let's say the new World Trade Center, I think you and I agree. Trump can order the Air Force to just kill those people who are about to crash into. They don't need a trial. And
right, but here's but I agree. There is direct defense, right? The problem is you say Alawaki is guilty. I assume when you mean that not only was he a member of a terrorist.
Know.
What do you mean you don't know?
Sorry, I don't know the factual predicates to. So when I said he was probably guilty, I think it was probably justified. I haven't reviewed the facts closely to make the determination, so I spoke too soon. But there are factual determinations there, and it seems like he was engaging in war against the United States based on my superficial reading, but I'm not willing to commit and defend that position right at this moment.
So when you're saying it's reviewable, though, what I would guess is if I'm a person that's concerned about due process, which I am, of the Trent-Daragawa members, I would have that same concern with anyone that was accused of terrorism before. In fact, I've been on record, even during the Bush administration, I'm a little older than you, I thought that the treatment of some of the terrorists in Guantanamo Bay was bullshit. I think that the treatment should be different for foreign terrorists. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they have the same rights as U.S. citizens. But I think the fact that there were people that were like left to rot in Guantanamo for 10, 15 years without ever having a case brought was fucking ridiculous. Well, if there's clear evidence that these people are terrorists, then prove it. Even if it's in a military court.
I agree with that, and that's why I think that your plain example there. I think that your intuition there is mapping onto like the impracticability or the dangerousness inherent in flight. I think that might be why your intuition is different. But I think, for example, Guantanamo Bay it's in Cuba, right? So it's outside of the United States, and we've had case law about places outside of America. I think there's a difference also here where they're giving it to a Salvadorian prison.
Is Guantanamo though considered American property, right?
I don't think it's considered an American territory. I believe you're not on American soil. I don't think it's considered American soil. For example, if you're born in Guantanamo Bay, are you an American citizen? I
would say, yeah. Is it materially different than being born on like an Air Force base?
I think it is, but that's a good question. I'll look into that, Rob.
My wife was born in Germany, but was born on an American base.
I don't know.
She's an American.
I don't know. That's a good question. I'll look into whether or not Guantanamo Bay is considered part of America. To be honest with you, I'm not going to represent that. I know that I don't.
By the way, if you could see the super chats, I'm not putting them up to needle you. I'm just not reading them.
What are they saying?
Why would Pisco speak without looking it up? And then this person says, the due process is that they can request a habeas corpus. Clearly that opportunity existed. 5 made the request. If they're a member of a class, TDA gang member over 14 non-US citizens, they go.
No, come guys.
They had to file
this is not
in Texas.
No, this is not. This is someone who's listening to the dissent, but it's complete garbage, right? Those 5 were able to file their lawsuit because they heard whispers that this lawsuit was coming, but that's 5 out of hundreds. And the reality is, because they prepared their papers before the proclamation was made available, that's why they were able to vindicate their rights. But in practical reality, right, these people don't. You have to file in the place in which you're being held, this habeas petition, but the government says, we don't need to tell your lawyers where you're at. And so what good is a right to habeas if most people, they don't even have to tell their lawyers where they're at, and they don't even have to give them notice of the basis of their removal? It's a complete shit show to trust that this habeas petition will work itself out when the government is saying blatantly that we have no obligation to give any notice or any process whatsoever before, so that they can rush to the airport before they have any chance to write down what's going on, before they have a chance to call their family, call their lawyer, and file a petition. What good is that right? It's an ephemeral right. It doesn't exist. It's fugazi, and that's part of what the
fuck's fugazi? Is that some slang I'm unaware of?
No, it's from. Have you seen Wolf of Wall Street?
No, never saw it.
Fugazi. It's a woozy. It's a wazi. It's not. It's a. I'm sure your chat knows.
Putting some fucking hex on me or some shit. Now, but I'll just say, to go back to the Alawaki thing, I think the problem is, like, the fact that there was a lack of curiosity, not just from you, though, granted, it's a little different. You were a little younger back then, and maybe you're not interested in looking that older case up now, but clearly there was a lack of curiosity from sort of organizations that would have said this person deserves some form of due process, and just an assumption.
I'm pretty sure the ACLU was against it. I'm pretty sure
I'm sure they were, but what was the case that they reached anywhere near the level we see the cases being reached now and the judicial decisions? Because in my understanding, and I could be wrong about this, there was never a review of the facts of the case as far as did he meet the proclaimed membership of a terrorist organization.
I'm pretty sure there was never a criminal investigation into the matter.
Right.
There were cases. Right now, I can't remember. I know that they were brought by some family members of Alawaki, and some were dismissed for lack of standing because I don't believe that they were the heirs or successor. It was just to the estate or whatever it was. So I'm not sure if there was ever full a resolving of that situation. But my recollection is it's pretty clear he was actually a member of Al-Qaeda and engaging in war against the United States.
But that's bullshit. Like, as a U.S. citizen, he has the right. If he was right, the difference is this: you're making this argument. Well, he's in the plane and they're about to hit the World Trade Center. Do you have the right? Okay, but that's different because I don't think anyone's alleged that he was about to take some sort of action, like in that moment, that justified a claim of self-defense. And that's like, I have the right to defend my life through self-defense, but I don't have the right to be like, I heard Pisco talking shit, and he may come at me someday, so I'm going to preemptively take him out.
Let me address that. So, for example, let's say that he was arriving at an airport in America or about to hit the airport. You couldn't just kill him, right? On his way to America. But the difference there is it practicable to apprehend him? I think that if it was practicable for Obama to capture him, he had an obligation to actually give him his day in court. I agree with you. The question is assume that there's no safe way to retrieve him in that moment, no reasonably safe way to obtain him and put him and charge him. In that situation, are you obligated as the American government to not kill him?
I think that you would be obligated to an absentia. Am I using that word correct? Have a trial.
To have a trial?
Right. To at least have someone operate as a defense, because the power is too tempting. Again, what's to stop me from being overseas? And let's say I'm in Ukraine and I'm accused by the Biden administration, like Gonzalo Lira style. I'm accused of collaborating with the Russians. And so they say, fuck it, let's take this dude out. What's to stop them from doing that? I'll tell you what it used to be. It used to be the notion that a president could be held criminally liable for his official conduct. Supposing that the official conduct were in violation, or the alleged official conduct were in violation of the law. This is one of the arguments that I was providing about the SEAL Team 6 memes, is because one of the fears of this, one of the reasons why we were going to worry about it as much is the notion that, imagine that you took an intentional act to kill someone in bad faith. Who you're saying that they're a terrorist member, but they're not actually a terrorist member. You're just using that as a pretext. What the Trump versus United States opinion tells us is you're not supposed to look into the actual intent of the individual. You're supposed to look at the nature of the power. But that presupposes that my hypothetical is that it was intentional to kill me in bad faith, as opposed to a legitimate fear that I might be working with Russians, and then later turns out that was incorrect.
Yeah, I agree.
So what's to prevent that?
Yeah, so in the case of them just being wrong after it's a good faith and
sure
about what's going on. I think in that situation, a lot more fuzzy about what the remedy might be. But if it's done in good faith, just like imagine like a police shooting done in good faith, right? And you get the wrong person. The Breonna, what's her name? The Breonna
Taylor.
The woman who is it Breonna Taylor? That's right.
So, yeah.
Right. One of the police officers who was just firing wildly, he was reckless, but he wasn't the one that actually shot the fatal shot. And the police officers there fired back at I think the boyfriend or the husband, who like heard the footsteps and assumed it was like a robber and started shooting. Now both parties were justified, right? The police was justified in shooting back at the boyfriend. The boyfriend was justified in shooting at them. And so in that situation, they're not criminally liable. The police officers are not criminally liable.
But that's different, because we're again talking an in the moment fear, direct fear of life being lost in that moment. That's different than the pre-planned execution of someone. Right?
Where it would be impracticable for the government to apprehend them through any other means, or to stop their conduct through any other means. That's
but
the
I
situation
think then the best solution would be, if we're concerned about due process, was the remedy to that should be in absentia, that there is at least some sort of formal hearing where the evidence is put forth, and that there needs to be some body that says, yes, we have determined that this does seem to meet the criteria, that this person is a member of that group.
But then remember, now the criminal defendant is not getting all the rights they're entitled to as a typical member. What you're acknowledging here is they're getting less rights than a typical criminal defendant would, in the sense that they don't have an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses themselves. They don't have, maybe their representative does, but they don't have an opportunity to be confronted, right, and to be in court and to attend the proceedings.
But we would accept that with other things. For example, if I'm comatose, I lose that right, and yet that trial would still occur, correct?
But that's what I mean. What due process is a term that, at a bare minimum, is supposed to imply notice and an opportunity to be heard. That's supposed to be like the threshold. And I agree with you in this context. There was no notice to Alawaki. There was no opportunity to be heard. There was no opportunity for his case to be heard before a neutral arbiter. And so I agree in terms of the normal criminal process. It didn't meet the bill. But the question is, how much does that change in the context of waging war, right? Would this, in the American Civil War context, would you require the president to go through a trial for every single American who they're ordering be killed in this war, in this conflict, in the Civil War, to prove that, in fact, they were part of the Confederacy? Not so sure about that. I think
right, but I would err on the side of that, and because every argument that you're making right now, if it is found legal that Trump is allowed to proclaim the Alien Enemy Act, in effect, what we're saying is these are adversarial terrorists that have been sent here by the government of Venezuela in order to cause harm to the safety of citizens of the United States.
Right, assuming they're facts, right?
But in effect, if forget if the person really is a member of Trinidad, we're just saying if we're allowed to accept that proclamation is legal, then in effect, basically what Trump's saying is we're at war, just like we were at war with Al-Qaeda.
Here's how I would distinguish, and you tell me what you think. And you don't have to, give your final opinion right now. And by the way, I enjoy these conversations. I think they're interesting. How I might distinguish is the following. There are other practicable solutions in the case of the Alien Enemies Act to give them their day in court. If there were similar type circumstances under Alawaki, I would agree with you. He needs to have his day in court. But in this situation, the courts aren't telling you can't apprehend them. The courts aren't telling you can't detain them. The court's not even telling you can't deport them through the other means under the INA. They're just saying don't deport them right now in the summary process under the Alien Enemies Act. And so here, in this case, it is practicable to give them this process in a way it simply isn't in the case of the Civil War. That's an extreme hypothetical. In the case of the 9/11, that's another extreme hypothetical. And maybe a less extreme hypothetical is the Alawaki case. I don't think it's practicable to imagine that the government can safely just go in and abscond with him.
There is a difference in sort of the practicality of being able to charge, but still, it seems to be what you're suggesting is, well, because we can't practically get Alawaki to have him here, then because that means that if we were to have him have a trial in absentia, he wouldn't have all the rights that he otherwise would be entitled to. Therefore, he gets none of the rights. That seems to be a bridge too far. It seems that the best compromise of this situation clearly is reasonable people. We wouldn't expect U.S. lives to be jeopardized to send like Navy SEALs in to try to capture this dude alive just to have a trial. Right.
So you agree with that, right?
I agree, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't afford up to the maximum available rights as a U.S. citizen that we would give anyone else.
So can I ask you a difficult question?
Let me finish real quick. Unless there was proof that there was an imminent attack occurring and it's like a Jack Bauer, oh shit, he has a dirty bomb he's about to release in 24 hours type shit.
So let's take out the imminence here. Thank you so much, Cyril, for every meal for the raid. So I'm explicitly not doing the Jack Bauer situation. It's not imminent, but it's the American citizen equivalent of Osama. He's the leader of an American citizen has become the head of Al-Qaeda, and we know where he's going to be on a date certain. We don't have time to do a trial in absentia. We also know, by the way, that there is no imminent attack coming. We don't have any reason to suppose there's an imminent attack coming. In that situation, right, where there's no imminence, there is no ability to give the trial. But this guy's the head of the Al-Qaeda. He's been made the new head of Al-Qaeda. Does America have a right to bomb the U.S. citizen head of Al-Qaeda when it's not practical to pick him up, even though there's no imminence?
Yeah, I would think I would go with the same scenario I just outlined. That in absentia, there should be proof given to some sort of neutral arbiter that he is in fact what we're claiming he is. That's what I would say.
Okay, but it would be easy to prove it if
right? He's publicly saying I'm the leader of Al-Qaeda.
So you're the president, right? President, Mr. Rob, Mr. Noor, President Noor. In 2 days, he's going to be there. That's all I know. But we need to take him out because he's the head of the organization. You're saying, okay, maybe go to there's special procedures, a special process, and in a day we present to a neutral arbiter that's not part of the executive branch for them to sign off on it, right? Yeah. It could be very quick, but it's okay, yes. Maybe on that doesn't sound so unreasonable.
Because we see that in law enforcement on a regular basis where there will be sort of emergency warrants that are necessary, like, holy shit, this guy that's a big gangster, we just found out that they're going to be in this unique spot. Can we get a warrant? But still, we don't say go ahead and proceed forth without the warrant. We still say that
although there are exceptions to the warrant requirement, typically they're exigent. Typically they're exigent.
But in general, but even still, can I envision a hypothetical situation where it's like, okay, forget the imminent attack, but we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to take out this person who happens to be an American citizen that we very much think is this person. I would argue that if you're worried that that situation could rise, that you could have had that hearing many moons ago, right? Like, almost like
the fact that you solicited an opinion from the OLC and you waited for an opinion from the OLC suggests that there was time for you to consider it.
Correct.
Okay.
Like we have sort of this FBI most wanted list. Why couldn't we have like
Rob? If what you're proposing is a kind of involvement of the courts that would allow for these kinds of summary procedures that don't take months, that take like days or weeks, but that I would maybe not even be opposed to. I think that's probably a good idea.
By the way, that's what I think should happen. And so for those listening, let me be clear. I'm not saying this as a defense to sort of Trans-Daragawa. I'm saying that it seems that many of the people that are concerned about due process now didn't have these sort of thoughts when it came to Alawaki, nowhere near to the level. And he was in both senses, but in two standards, I think his case is more severe. One, that the punishment was death, right? And second, that he was an American citizen and not just a green card holder. So in both of those,
but then there's the other side of the equation. So yes, I agree. Those are things that weigh it more heavily in the Alawaki situation. Sure. But the thing that makes it a little different on the other side of the ledger is it was impracticable to give him the same kinds of procedures.
You're certainly right. But what I'm arguing is I think that at the minimum, there's no reason that the Trump administration can't be. If I'm saying, well, you could have these emergency fast courts for Alawaki, why couldn't you do that with the Trans-Daragawa members? And like, I know the counter argument to that. Well, there's going to be too many of them. It'll get bogged down, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think the burden of proof should be as high as sort of the trial that me and you would get if it was practicable to arrest us. We're accused of a crime. Right. We could talk to our attorney. It wouldn't be necessarily that same level of standard. But what I think is one of the things that weighs in factor to me of why this is wrong, what's going with the Trump, I don't understand the immediacy. The need for the immediacy where it's like, there is a remedy, detain them, right? Detain them. And if you're like, well, we only have 50,000, okay, but there surely are people that you could release that are less dangerous than these accused terrorists. So you could make room for these. And if it would somehow happen to be over 50,000, right? So like that's the point. Like it seemed to me like I'm hardcore, get shitty people out of the country. And I know you are. Get illegals out of the country, but there's still levels to this shit. And I'm unpersuaded, well, they're illegals anyway, so fuck them. That's not the standard that I have. The standard I have would be they're still fucking human beings, and if you're accusing them of being terrorists and basically throwing them in a black hole in El Salvador, they should at least have the right to defend themselves from these accusations that they're terrorists. I do find it that many of the people that are arguing against this probably want open borders to the extent we had in Biden. I think it's bullshit, the idea that Democrats tried to argue all of a sudden that they cared about the border. They didn't. We could see that, in my opinion.
Well, I think Biden kind of gave the game away by claiming he needed congressional action, and then doing
Correct.
nothing until the 2024.
And then using executive action at the end.
Yeah. So I criticized him harshly for that because I thought what he was doing is illegal, just like I think what Trump is doing right now is illegal at the border and, closing off asylum, but the courts will figure that out and determine that. So maybe I'm wrong about that. But ultimately, I think that you raised a lot of really good points there. And one aspect of the Alien Enemies Act that, it's lost on people, it's been invoked 3 other times in our history: the War of 1812, the First World War, and the Second World War. And we gave hearings to Nazis, right? Like people, Nazis who were detained and deported under the Alien Enemies Act in World War II. They got hearings. So if we're going to give hearings to literal German in a declared war and who are Nazis, I think that that's a bare minimum that you can apply here. But what really scares me is the executive. There are a lot of different actions that Trump is doing that are like this, that he's claiming unreviewability, executive fiat. And the end result here is once you're in that El Salvadorian jail, I don't know what a court can do for you. Once you're there, I don't know what a court can do.
It would be interesting. Like, presumably, the United States could still do something if Trump voluntarily was like, "Okay, I'll get him back."
Yeah, but is he going to be inclined to get some illegal immigrant who was about to get their asylum hearing and bring him back?
Right, that's the point.